I get a lot of comments on videos saying that owning an EV is going to be too inconvenient for people. It's too difficult. Doing any form of long distance journey will be too hard. But how true is that? Let's consider a real world journey and work out how difficult it really is. Then we'll know for sure. Sometimes when I'm working on a video, I know what I want to do, but it's hard to find an end to the topic. And then sometimes the premise falls into my lap. I wasn't entirely sure how to approach the topic of convenience. And then, by sheer coincidence, an opportunity arose that I couldn't ignore. My brother has been looking to change his car. Considering various options, he finally settled on what he wanted and found a car with all of the features he was after on the second-hand market. He couldn't resist, so he paid a deposit and planned to collect it a few days later. There was just one little wrinkle. It was 500 miles away, in Aberdeen. So started a 1,000-mile journey to collect his new toy, trading in his old car at the same time. This makes for an interesting experiment. His old car was a diesel, and his new one a petrol hybrid, and so there are no limitations placed upon the journey by the cars. This trip is entirely unadulterated. It's not uncommon for people to tell us EV YouTubers that a diesel car can do 500 miles on a tank, so his trip in his diesel estate could probably be done in a single leg. But would it be? Is that what people do in real life? Start the experiment. He set off in cold weather, just a few degrees above freezing, with a full tank and no set plan. He'd stop when he felt like it, with an overnight stay in Stirling to avoid being drowsy on the return leg. So what did he do? Did he drive to Stirling in one go? No, he did not. After all, he is human. He decided on a trip up the M6 and stopped at Knutsford and Southwaite for about 15 minutes each, making Stirling at about midnight. The following morning he finished the trip up to Aberdeen, did the handover and started the return journey. Again, that was not done in one go. He stopped just south of the Forth Bridge and at T-Bay for 15 minutes each, and then at Stafford Services for 30 minutes. His 1,000-mile odyssey took about 29 hours in total, door to door. 3 stops on the way up and 3 on the way back. So that makes for an interesting benchmark. A journey where the cars didn't limit him. He did it based solely on how he felt and to manage the risk of drowsiness. We can use that benchmark to answer today's question: how inconvenient are EVs? Well, let's plan that trip using an EV and see what the differences would be. So for the EV, I've chosen a Volkswagen ID.7 Pro Tourer. It's a nice car, an expensive car, but second-hand, it's in the ballpark of what he bought. The Pro has a 77 kilowatt-hour usable battery capacity. There are Pro S and GTX models, both with larger batteries, but let's not use that cheat code. And for fun, I've also assumed it doesn't have a heat pump. Volkswagen charged quite a lot for a heat pump, so I'm not sure an awful lot of them will have that extra fitted. It's handy in cold weather. It means the range loss is a bit less, but it's probably not worth paying a lot of money for, in my opinion. What we can do is plan the same trip using a better route planner, a useful planning and estimation tool. To avoid the site trying to dictate the journey, I've planned each leg separately. I did the planning on a frosty morning to match the weather as closely as possible, and I've also limited the maximum charging speed at each stop to get realistic figures for charging. The ID.7 can charge at up to 195 kilowatts, but it only does those top speeds at the low end of the battery, even when using its battery preconditioning. A better route planner knows the approximate charging curve of the car and takes that into account, but to be sure of realistic numbers, I've capped most stops at a peak of 125 kilowatts and stops at a higher state of charge at a peak of 115 kilowatts. We leave his area at 100% state of charge, and after 150 miles arrive at Knutsford with 40%. Here we hit our first slight inconvenience, a peculiarity of this part of the M6. Unfortunately, this northbound section of the M6 hasn't had charger upgrades yet, and the DC rapid chargers at Knutsford can only manage 60 kilowatts, which is not great for a road trip. So instead we come off the M6 at the next junction and head to charge us 6 minutes off the motorway, either at the Weathers and Whistle pub or at the nearby Costa, whichever we prefer. Our 15-minute stop at either of those gets us back to 74% state of charge, ready for our next leg up to Southwaite, another 118 miles. Southwaite has had its charger upgrades, so we go from 25% to 62% in our stop there. The final leg of day one, 119 miles, takes us to the hotel in Stirling with 16% remaining. Here we hit our second slight inconvenience, because this hotel doesn't have any charge points yet. Instead, we're going to park 8 minutes away, putting the car on charge at an AC charge point for an overnight, unsupervised top-up. My brother got moving fairly early the following morning, so we're only going to go back to about 70% state of charge in the time available. But that's plenty to get us to Aberdeen the following morning, arriving with 23%, ready for the handover of the car for our replacement. If we start our return journey in the new car with 100%, we'll get to MFG Newbridge with 52%, and assuming 100 kilowatt peak charging, we get back to 80% in our 15-minute stop. We reach T-Bay with 27%, and another 15 minutes gets us up to 64%. For the final stop, we stop at Sandbach rather than Stafford, because there are lots of very fast chargers at Sandbach. The 30-minute stop we do here gets us plenty of charge to get home with no problem. So the inconvenience we suffered were stopping off the motorway at Knutsford, not parking at the hotel in Stirling, and stopping at Sandbach instead of Stafford. Plus we had to plug in when we stopped, paying with a contactless card or similar. Not so inconvenient after all. Maybe this EV thing isn't the disaster that some people consider it to be. The difference in the journeys between ICE and EV would be fairly small. Now some of you probably think I cheated by swapping cars at Aberdeen. That's exactly why he went, remember, but I take the point. It's a bit like the early days of Formula E, where they changed cars halfway through the race due to battery capacity limitations. Let's pretend that he didn't pick up a new car. Instead, let's say he did his 1,000-mile trip only to reject the new car and returned home in the original one. How would the return trip look then? Well, we're only at 23% when we arrive, remember, and let's say we didn't charge while there. So we're going to need a stop fairly early on in order to restore the state of charge. A better route planner suggests stopping at Eon Aberdeen for 15 minutes. Then we get to MFG Newbridge with 20% and T-Bay with 12%. Then our intended stop at Sandbach instead of Stafford gets us home without a problem. So on this alternative return journey caused by an entirely unexpected outcome at the dealership, we simply did one more stop of 15 minutes and stopped at Sandbach instead of Stafford to get access to better chargers. There were a couple of inconveniences, it's fair to say, but hopefully you can appreciate that they were probably far less than the doubters might imagine. We were very close to matching what we did in the ICE cars in the real journey. Furthermore, with an EV, there are a bunch of conveniences to bear in mind. If we can charge at home, then the majority of our charging happens there, so we don't need to visit petrol stations in order to carry out our everyday driving tasks of shorter journeys. What's more, we get a quieter car with a smoother drivetrain. We get torque in abundance, allowing rapid acceleration if we need or want it, and we can cool or heat the car remotely, making it more comfortable from the outset. In monetary terms, it costs pretty much the same to buy on the second-hand market as an equivalent ICE car, and it's a lot cheaper to run, if we can access a cheap rate overnight tariff, so it's not financially inconvenient. One quick note about planning. I planned this on a better route planner, which might look inconvenient in itself. That's only because I don't have the car in question. If I did have an ID7, then I probably would have planned it in the car. The inbuilt sat-nav in the ID7 has a good planning system, much better than earlier ID models. Using the onboard sat-nav results in all of our charge stops being calculated for us and updated dynamically. We don't have to think about them. What's more, the car will automatically precondition the battery en route for the best charging speeds at each stop. But there's another type of inconvenience we need to bear in mind: the inconvenience of climate change. People talk as though there is no inconvenience to driving an ICE car, but the impacts of carbon emissions are going to be something we all need to adapt to. The weather is going to continue to get wilder, more extreme swings, more flooding, droughts, wider swings in temperature, worse storms causing more property damage. The longer we leave it before we make the necessary changes, the worse those effects are going to get, and the more inconvenience we will suffer as a result. We either change now or pay later. In summary, an EV was pretty inconvenient on a road trip 10 years ago. Some of them maybe even 5 years ago. But the latest crop of cars, with their long ranges, fast charging and inbuilt planning, almost completely close the gap on ICE cars. Furthermore, we should not overlook the convenience of driving an EV for everyday use. There are a lot of features that make them more convenient for the majority of our journeys. You have to consider the whole picture when deciding whether an EV is right for you, the conveniences as well as the inconveniences. When doing that, it's getting to the point where fewer and fewer people will find a valid reason to stop them from taking the plunge. Finally, if you think your situation is different from everyone else's, then be sure you are questioning that. That could be true, or it could be that the self-centered bias that forms a part of our human psyche is tricking you into thinking so. Thanks very much for joining me. Your questions and comments on this subject are most welcome. If you've done an EV road trip, did you find it to be inconvenient in the last few years? If you've liked the video, then it's a help to me if you click the thumbs up button. And consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more from me. Thanks.